Good afternoon, everyone. This is Brian with Risk-Based Security. This is normally where my company would have marketing come on and introduce everything, but I kind of evicted marketing largely from this entire ordeal. We sincerely appreciate you taking time out of your day, because one point I will make during the presentation is that many companies are facing reduced staffing, and that means that the time is extremely valuable right now. This presentation was originally going to be just about our 2019 year-end vulnerability report, but in light of recent events, we decided to switch focus. That kind of explains why I'm doing this presentation, because I was going to talk about vulnerabilities for an hour. And so before we start all this, I want to share a few words that are kind of off script. My marketing director probably has a look of terror on his face right now. So I don't give presentations that often, and this topic isn't my wheelhouse or generally the type of topic I would even cover. At my core, I'm a vulnerability database nerd. I aggregate vulnerabilities, and there's a lot of nuances that come with that. And when I do present, I usually take 3 to 6 months to build out a slide deck, and it has excessive citations and presenter notes. It's built on a world of data and my personal experience. For this, don't really have a lot of personal experience about living in a pandemic, and I had less than 2 weeks to give this, or to put together this presentation. Because we're talking about a pandemic, it carries a lot of grief and uncertainty, and we don't want to be salesy at all. If you or your loved ones have been exposed to this virus, or if you live in fear of contracting it, you have my sympathy and care, because as someone with an underlying health condition that was declared to be a high risk, every day I kind of have a little bit of terror myself. What happens if I catch it? What does it mean? So while I say that this topic is not my area of expertise, unfortunately, I think it has to become all of our expertise now, at least for the coming months. For those who know me, and in my marketing department's dismay, of course, I'm the worst salesperson ever. They won't let me get anywhere near a sales contract, because I'll just give you the farm, no questions asked. So today, my goal is just to have an honest talk about the topics. We'll give you a brief glimpse into the world of vulnerability aggregation, which is my thing. It's where I live day to day. And then after that, a much longer conversation about information security during the pandemic, which is the real topic at hand. I've included my email address. It's in the attached document that you can get to in your BrightTalk interface somewhere. If you'd like to reach out directly to me about this presentation, about vulnerabilities in general, please feel free, and we'll just have a one-on-one chat and kind of go from there. So with that, we will go into things. So housekeeping, which is a cleaning pun during a pandemic, which is a great start. The recording of today's session will be made available on BrightTalk and on our website, so you can share the link with anyone that couldn't join. I am very big on citations, so we have a PDF that contains about 80 different references that back up all the material in the presentation. We'll also give you some further reading. This was originally part of our series of webinars focused on trends and vulnerabilities and such, but obviously we shifted topics. We like to hear from you. We want to hear your questions. So as we go through the talk, you can use the questions box there in your interface. Unfortunately, BrightTalk has about a 2-minute broadcasting delay, so we can't do real-time Q&A, but we have someone on the line that's going to take all your questions, put them in a document for me, and at the end of the talk, we'll go through them. If you're watching the replay or need to get in touch with us, you can do it via the contact page on the website, or like I said, email me directly instead. You know, just easier, faster, no marketing. And fair warning, since marketing got the boot, the graphics in this presentation aren't exactly stellar, as I have zero graphic talent. So my name is Brian Martin. I'm your host today. I tried to get our CEO, Jake, to do this presentation, but he said something about dealing with the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, whatever that is, and his eye was kind of twitching. Day to day, I've got a fancy title, but it means about nothing. I tend to work on a little of everything in the company. I still do some support mails. I work on the database. I help with marketing. Occasionally I get roped into sales, a little of everything. My first vulnerability database was maintained in '93. Been doing this for 24 years. I have other experience that's related. If I had my choice of titles, I'd be a vulnerability historian because I love the history of vulnerabilities. In fact, the first one in our database goes back to 1902, and if you don't know that story, email me. It's fascinating, and I'll share some links. I like small misunderstood creatures. I'm known for my love of squirrels, especially. It's my second pandemic because we're not counting the Y2K bug. So when some aspect of life is kind of overwhelming, I tend to turn to humor a little bit. I'm not making fun of the situation, rather trying to keep it light. I kind of caught my marketing director in a trap and got him to say that, yes, I could do anything I wanted with the slides. So I did. So it looks like I already forgot to advance a slide. Sorry about that. The downside of Bright Talk. Anyway, moving on to some more real content. In today's discussion, we're going to cover, like I said, some vulnerability trends. We're also going to dispel one of the long-standing myths around what vulnerability staff can do. And then the real core topics. We're going to talk about the impact the pandemic has on the humans, on the security side, regulatory, working from home challenges, e-commerce, supply chain, bad intelligence, and then a little bit of kind of guesswork on where we're going from here. So highlights. Like I said, we're going to start off with just 4 different charts from our year-end analysis, and 3 of those are going to set the stage to kind of go into the bigger picture on the pandemic. So they are a good lead-in. It's going to give us an idea what the vulnerability disclosure landscape looks like. And like I said, it goes into those adjacent topics. I'll tell you how vulnerability statistics are easy to misinterpret and the disclaimers that must go with them. And as you can see from the picture, yeah, no graphic skills. So we'll begin with the 2019 vulnerability totals. Have a couple charts here to give you kind of a visual representation. Quick background, vulnerability intelligence these days, it's not like it was 20 years ago where you could monitor 1 or 2 mail lists, bug track, and full disclosure. At the beginning of 2019, we were monitoring over 2,600 different sources. And by the end of the year, we were monitoring almost 3,500. So in the span of 12 months, we actually added 850 new sources. And they can be anything from a mail list to a vendor blog, developer resources like a change log or commit histories, whatever is required to monitor for the products our customers are using, and then as many other products as we can. So that really kind of speaks to the evolution of where vulnerability databases have gone. Last year, our single day record was 313 vulnerabilities published. And for those who work on a security response team, if you have to deal with that many in a day, you have my sympathies. It's rough on us, and we just have to give you the information. Your teams have to actually patch them and deal with them, which is kind of scary in my eyes. So last year, we averaged about 68 vulnerabilities a day. But we believe in a living database, meaning that we're updating the older entries constantly. Last year, we averaged about 300 entries that we updated every day. 300 different ones, different days, obviously, with a record of 2,871 updates in a single day last year. So looking at the chart, you may notice there's a dip in 2019 compared to 2018, giving the appearance of less vulnerabilities. For a variety of reasons, disclosures may be made on a given day, but they're not aggregated until days, weeks, or even months later. Sometimes they appear to be disclosed 1 year, like in a formal advisory, but when we go dig, we find that it was originally disclosed maybe a day, a month, or a year before that. And that could have been found in a bug tracker or something else. And so that causes us to adjust the date. In 2018, when we published our report, we showed just over 22,000 vulnerabilities, but by the end of 2019, we had over 23,000 vulnerabilities. So there's this constant state of aggregation, and as we're adjusting the dates or finding ones that were disclosed last year, these numbers are constantly moving. So anytime you see a chart like this, you should take it with a grain of salt that, okay, those numbers are great, we see them, but there's disclaimers. There's an explanation as to why one number is bigger than the other. So one of the things we'll talk about during this presentation is supply chain risk. And in the software world, that's usually in the form of third-party libraries or dependencies. In many ways, there seems to be a significant gap in perception when it comes to vulnerabilities or databases. On one hand, we have the old familiar perception that it's used to, or that the data is used to secure your organization, meaning you want vulnerabilities in your routers, Windows, in your firewalls, and all the devices that you use. And that data is then used to patch those vulnerabilities. On the other hand, developer teams are focusing on third-party libraries. And they do that because of all those dependencies that are used within their own code. In our experience, we get about a 50-50 mix of companies that come to us for one over the other. For those who use the data to secure their enterprise, the number of vulnerabilities is sometimes academic in the past. Because even though there might have been 22,000 vulnerabilities last year, they don't all affect you or your organization, or some of them were so low risk, or the method for exploitation is so absurd that it doesn't matter to you. So in the new era of a pandemic, it takes on a different meaning. While some companies are laying off IT staff, including security positions, that means that more vulnerabilities have to be triaged by less people with the same stakes as before. The library side is interesting because a single piece of desktop software like Adobe Reader has over 100 third-party dependencies in it. And then that's based on their third-party license declarations. Vulnerabilities in those dependencies, whether it's accidental coding errors or a malicious party disrupting the supply chain, it poses a risk to you and every customer that uses your software. So these may be more difficult to immediately understand the risk scenario, but ultimately could have a lot bigger impact worldwide. And like prior years in 2019, we saw a significant gap in coverage between our data and other vulnerability intelligence sources. And so we kind of threw up a comparison of us versus CVE to show you an example that there is this big gap. And this is kind of worrisome to many people in the general software industry, since these vulnerabilities can propagate downstream and they could cause an issue in basically every sector. So a simple widget library could be used in everything from a personal blog to a SCADA system. So remember when I said that we're going to dispel a myth and that vuln stats can be misinterpreted? This is one of the, probably the number one area that we see it in. And one of the questions that's been asked for a long time is, which vendor has the most vulnerabilities? And this is probably one of the first questions that was ever asked of vulnerability stats. And the answer to that is it's not simple, or it's not even relevant anymore. I don't think anyone here is purchasing an operating system where security is the number one decision-making factor. I hope that it factors in, but probably not, because ultimately functionality still rules the day. Consider these points when thinking about vulnerabilities by vendor. So a large company that has dozens or even hundreds of acquisitions, they can't be compared to a company that only has a few. Take, for example, Oracle, that has acquired tons of companies. Well, that's why we see the Oracle CPUs every 3 months with impressive numbers. So it's patching 330 different vulnerabilities. A lot of us that have been around a long time still think of Oracle as in Oracle the database, and actually a fraction of those vulnerabilities affect the database. Some affect Java, some affect all this other software they've acquired or developed over the years. Also remember that when one company acquires another, they acquired their vulnerabilities and that vulnerability history as well. So if we look at SUSE, software in the public interest, which is Debian, Canonical, Ubuntu, or Red Hat, we see the range from 911 to 1379 for the vulnerabilities. But in reality, the Linux kernel itself accounted for over 25% of the vulnerabilities in Red Hat and 21% of them in SUSE. And of those kernel vulnerabilities, many are in drivers that aren't even installed by default. But if the code ships with the distribution, the vendor tends to fix them and likely gets counted in their advisories. So in that vein, how you install and configure your Linux distribution could open you up or make you safe from hundreds of those vulnerabilities and drastically change the security posture. So that means that realistically, even though we have these great numbers, we can't actually compare two Linux distributions, let alone the old Linux versus Windows or Multics versus Commodore 64, whatever operating system you want to talk about. So one of the big events in our lives these days is Patch Tuesday. On our side, we have to monitor all the vendors we can. We're looking for the proverbial Patch Tuesday. We know that Microsoft is going to release. They started this back in 2003, and at the time it was a great idea. But once that started, other vendors said, well, wait, we should release on that day too. And Adobe was one of the first to follow. And then after that, more of them. And so when all these vendors release at the same time, we kind of use the hurricane terminology, which is the Fujiwara effect. When two hurricanes collide. In our case, it's a lot more than two. Even back in 2014, we would see Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, Mozilla, and Adobe all release on one day. That happened, like I said, in 2014, and then it happened again in January of this year. And it's going to happen again next month in April and July. So we went from one of those events back in 2014 to three of them this year. And so what does the perfect storm look like these days? We know for sure that Microsoft, Oracle, Adobe, SAP, Siemens, and Schneider Electric are going to release. The other vendors that love to jump in on that, Google, Apple, Mozilla, Intel, Cisco, F5, Juniper, and others. When you think about it, that's a crazy amount of vendors to release on a single day. Now, sure, it's great that you have this advance warning, but it's also, oh, hell, we have to have all hands on deck. We have to figure out a new triage process. We have to figure out, are these even going to impact us? What's the severity? What's the exploit scenario look like? So it's a lot crazier times, even though it is coordinated to a degree. And all these vendors like to talk about coordinated disclosure, the other bad word, responsible disclosure. But in reality, in their coordination, they're actually making it harder on their customers in some ways. So for January's perfect storm a few months ago, we got really lucky, and it was a very light Microsoft release of only 48 vulnerabilities. But one of them was a pre-authentication remote code execution. So that kind of factors into the mix that, yeah, it was a lighter load, but one of them was really nasty. Oracle, they said they were fixing 333 vulnerabilities, but they ended up releasing patches for 325, and only 197 of them were actually new issues. The rest had already been disclosed. And when I say we got lucky, Adobe only released 9 vulnerabilities, which is a far cry from their usual load of anywhere from 50 to 80. So the next two perfect storms, we're really curious what we're going to see, because we know that it could be as many as 500 on either of those days. So if the vulnerability nerd in you is, all excited, we have a report you can download later. And if you want to talk shop with me, feel free. I love talking about this aspect of the vulnerability world. So now, the meat of the presentation based on the title we gave you. Let's see. So fun fact, our marketing director's from England. When I asked him for a picture of a squirrel, he sent me one of an eastern gray, which is the big squirrel there, and not the iconic red squirrel from his home country. So he's officially earned the term expat, and he's fully assimilated into the American ways. And as you can see, he's never going to let me do slides again, which is kind of cool. So we'll begin with a couple things that we'd likely never thought about before moving into the world of a pandemic. Some kind of the light-hearted fun ones. Some producers of alcohol have started using their discarded material to make hand sanitizer. Bacardi even did not only did that, but they launched an entire campaign around it called Raise Your Spirits. And no, they're not a sponsor, but if they'd like to send us booze, we'll take it. Vietnam's Ministry of Health has created a catchy coronavirus prevention song, which I'm not about to sing for you. Several CEOs in India, the US, and other countries are foregoing their salary to help ensure their employees are paid during a time when their jobs are essentially on hold, which is very cool. But on the darker side, we have companies like Spectrum that instead of offering hazard pay, offered a $25 gift card to their technicians who were going into the homes of people that may have coronavirus, which is kind of scary, and it's like, what's going on there? We've seen most security conferences canceled this year or opted to reschedule for later, except for CanSec West, which actually opted to carry on, but they did so with mask and doing temperature checks. So they were taking precautions, but still had the conference. Kind of weird in the world of risk. You know, that was kind of a one-off situation where I think they're the only conference that carried on. So the global pandemic and the impact on humans. One of the questions that's been thrown around quite a bit is, why is this pandemic different? For those who don't remember, and I had to certainly look these up, some of the past ones were from 1918 to 20, the H1N1 pandemic, and that was dubbed the Spanish flu. From 56 to 58, H2N2, the death toll was 2 million. That was dubbed the Asian flu. 1968, which is H3N2, the death toll of 1 million, dubbed the Hong Kong flu. And the last one that many of us lived through was 2009 to 10, H1N1/09. The death toll was somewhere between 150 and 575,000, which is a big range. And that one was dubbed the swine flu. So in modern history, we haven't seen a pandemic like this one with wildly different predictions, ranging from 80,000 to 200,000 deaths in the US alone. Again, that's a huge swing, but obviously it's a prediction, and it's based on us not having a lot of data. There have been estimates that this could infect 81% of the US or even half of the world's population. Those numbers seem extreme, and of course we don't know how bad it'll be in the end, but even if we focus on the numbers we're seeing now, it's very hard to wrap our minds around. So outside of a dystopian book or a movie, we haven't even seen or imagined events like 3.3 million people in the US filing for unemployment in a single week. During the last recession, the peak was only 665,000. So that's a huge jump. Some predictions are saying unemployment may hit as high as 30%. There are reports that hospitals across the US are considering universal do not resuscitate orders for coronavirus patients. A global pandemic and ransomware is hitting some of these public health websites and hospitals. People are seriously suggesting we triage by age and let the elderly die to save the economy. One New York hospital had to rent a freezer truck to store the bodies of their victims. Spain has had to resort to using an ice skating rink as a temporary morgue. We can see mass graves in Iran so large they're visible from space. And global events like the Olympics have been postponed to the tune of $6 billion in loss. In Brazil, criminal gangs are imposing strict curfews to slow the spread of the virus because the government's not doing anything. Think about all of those. None of us ever thought we would see this, and just thinking about living during this time and during these events, it's very weird, and I just don't have a better way to say it. So how about the global pandemic and the impact on security? Now that we have the dark reminder of how the world has been upended in the last few months, what does it mean for us? So with the pandemic came the economic recession. While consumers rushed to panic buy toilet paper and water, many organizations immediately started laying off staff, including parts of the security teams. The last time we saw a recession was 2009, and fraud on the internet spiked considerably. The year before that recession, almost 73,000 complaints of fraud were sent to law enforcement. But in 2009, 40,000 were sent in the first quarter alone. So that last recession saw a real big jump in reported crime or online crime. In 2009, a study by KPMG found that many enterprises believe that the recession put their business at greater risk from out-of-work IT workers tempted to join the criminal underground. That's mostly a direct quote. So hell hath no fury like an IT worker scorned. And obviously, they are a bigger threat because they have intimate knowledge of your organization, your networks, and while they certainly should have had their credentials revoked, that doesn't mean that they don't have other ways back into the organization. So during this pandemic, we know that the bad actors aren't going to hit the pause button. Coronavirus phishing scams started circulating in January before a lot of us understood how serious this was. The media outlet Bleeping Computer reached out to 2 ransomware gangs and asked if they would continue to hit the health industry. They actually reached out to a lot of them, but 2 replied to it, which is kind of neat. And those ransomware groups said they would, quote, take it easy, but then stipulated that pharmaceutical companies were still fair game, which is interesting. We saw articles saying the pandemic sets the stage for, quote, hacking mayhem, and that we can expect cyber attacks of all sorts to take advantage. So there's a lot of concern over it, some great headlines, but in reality, what have we seen? And those ransomware groups saying, oh, we're going to take it easy on the healthcare industry. Well, it doesn't seem like that actually happened because we saw the Maze ransomware extort a vaccine testing facility already. We saw an attack on a hospital that's one of the largest COVID-19 testing facilities in the Czech Republic, forcing them to relocate new patients to other hospitals. The Maze ransomware group hit the Hammersmith Medicines Research, which is a vaccine testing center, stealing data and posting it online. The Champaign-Urbana Public Health District website, which was distributing vital information about COVID-19, was compromised by the NetWalker ransomware. And bad actors are compromising D-Link and Linksys routers to point them to coronavirus-themed malware. So clearly, whatever the bad guys are saying, it doesn't matter. We're seeing a lot of activity. Let's talk about the financial impacts we're facing. So as we know, the global economy has taken a serious hit. Between late February and early March, the Dow dropped over 12%, and the S&P dropped over 17%. And as we moved into that recession, there was even talk speculating that the U.S. was facing a depression. We saw airlines announce that they would have to do massive layoffs, and then we saw the stimulus package. Everyone was like, okay, airlines, you got your money. And even after that, one of the airlines said, well, that money carries us until September, and we'll go ahead and announce we're doing layoffs on September 1, essentially. So even after getting that money, we're still facing this weird, just major impact of the economy that it's hard to understand right now. In the security world, we're seeing the decreased IT staffing, and it's opening ourselves to a new possibility of serious lawsuits. So what happens if a data breach occurs and you have minimized your staff? Well, the lawsuit can not only say, well, you were negligent, but they can say, look, you even, scaled back on your security staff. What did you think was going to happen? And for those that aren't following data breaches, we've seen over 700 organizations face a lawsuit after a data breach, and we're positive that number is drastically underreported. Speaking of, just today, Marriott International confirmed a data breach affecting 5.2 million guests. It's a good thing that InfoSec doesn't travel much, so we should be clear of that one, I hope. With the increased working from home scenario, we're going to see more service outages possibly as traffic overloads capacity. Companies that had planned for small bumps in traffic may not have planned for this kind of increase. The company OneWeb is going to file for bankruptcy, and it's not exclusively due to the pandemic, but it seems to be a major factor that because of the economic uncertainty, the investment that they were expecting didn't come through. O'Reilly Media, a lot of us know for the O'Reilly books and such, they've closed their live conference business after canceling Strata Data, Velocity, OSCon, and all of that was a direct result of the pandemic. So regulatory change, because our industry has a couple regulations that we have to deal with. This is a time when regulations being increased or more enforced would be beneficial in some ways, but we're actually seeing the opposite. Convenience has always been the enemy of security, and it probably will be for a long time. As of March 15, the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services declared a limited waiver on some provisions of the HIPAA privacy rule. Some of those changes kind of make sense to me personally, like the requirement to obtain a patient's agreement to speak with family members or friends directly involved in the patient's care. Others aim at privacy regs like the requirements to honor a request to opt out of the facility directory, or the patient's right to request privacy restrictions, and the patient's right to request confidential communications. With hospitals already overcrowded in some states, some of those regulations being kind of lax, I get it. But this also essentially tells us that these privacy laws are important-ish, that they were important when convenient, but now when they're not convenient, they're not so important. And I have a feeling that both legal and policy wonks are going to have debate material for years over this. But one of the questions that we as practitioners have to think about is if these regulations lose teeth when they're turned back on. What happens after the pandemic? Is there any threat of retroactive punishment? For example, what if a hospital misinterpreted one of the new guidelines and overstepped while dealing with patients during the insane conditions mid-pandemic? Will they become liable? How about any of the organizations that we deal with, financial or otherwise? Are they going to face some, well, that's what we said, but now that we saw what it really meant, we have to hold you accountable? So hopefully that's something that IT directors and management will be talking with their C-levels and their legal counsel to make sure that they fully understand what these regulatory changes mean. So during this time, there's got to be a continued balance of privacy, even for healthcare workers who are facing probably the biggest threat. Everyone wants this pandemic to go away quick. We know that. And in our industry, I believe we appreciate data more than most. We're probably all fans of using big data to help understand a problem and to come up with solutions. But when did that go too far? And so far, we've seen the South Korean government is using surveillance cameras, smartphone location data, credit card purchases, all to trace the movements. All to trace the movements of their citizens. And they're doing that to create virus transmission chains to try to figure out where it's moving from one person to another. In Italy, the authorities are analyzing location data from mobile phones to determine who's obeying the government lockdown orders and looking at their movement patterns. And one article said that about 40% are moving around, quote, too much. In Israel, the Internal Security Agency, they're starting to use mobile phone data originally intended for counterterrorism operations, but now to track citizens that could have been exposed to the virus. So those are cases where the public has no say in the use of that data. On the other hand, some will voluntarily give up that privacy to help. In San Francisco, around 2,000 emergency medical workers will be wearing rings that track body temperature and other vital signs, trying to identify the early onset of COVID-19 to help curb its spread. And so one question that would be fun to consider for us is, imagine if Fitbit gave over all of their users' health data for analysis for the greater good. And it makes me wonder, have we looked at their terms of service lately? Because I sure haven't. So social distancing has become kind of a privacy game of sorts. Recently, we saw a company called, I think it's Unicast. They used their collected phone geolocation data to launch a social distancing scoreboard that grades which residents are changing the behavior at the urging of health officials and government lockdowns. And it's based on the reduction in distance we travel to determine if we're staying at home. And they concluded that Washington, D.C. got an A and Wyoming earned an F. And that's kind of fun and interesting, but I'd love to read the disclaimers on that, because you can actually go 100 miles in Wyoming and still be on your own property in some cases, versus DC, obviously the opposite. So ultimately, while I like data and I love these visuals, does it really matter? As my friend Mike Osman points out, infection data at the county level instead of the state level. And if you look at the map, it's nearly indistinguishable from any map that indicates population density, such as light seen from space. So these maps are kind of good visuals, but they're not really telling a good picture unless you get down to a really granular level. So working from home, I know for some of us, we've been doing it most of our careers. For others, it's a new experience, and there's probably some ups and downs for you. Trying to do a full day's worth of work with your loved ones around that don't understand the concept that this has now become your office and they don't knock when they enter, that takes a little getting used to. Companies are going to be facing these new challenges when it comes to security and privacy as well. First, the virtual meeting technologies we use are basically privacy nightmares. And based on articles that we've aggregated to look at these very recently, it's not something we usually do, Cisco WebEx shares registration, host, and usage with service providers, contractors, and, quote, other third parties. Google Hangouts analyzes everything about you, as we know, the same way Google does with anything else, all in the effort to put the best ads in front of you, among other things. We know that Slack has seen an incredible spike in usage, jumping from 1 million simultaneously connected users in 2015 to over 10 million this year, and then 11 million this year, then 12 million this year, all in the last 2 months. So they're seeing an incredible traction. So if you've moved to Slack recently and you haven't been using it before, if you're relying on the free instance, it's important to understand that you cannot delete messages. You can search the last 10,000, but after that, they're deleted to you, but they're held at Slack, even historically. And they're available to Slack employees, law enforcement, and civil subpoenas, as well as any hackers who breach Slack. If you have a corporate or paid instance, you control how many messages are retained. Zoom seems to be the worst and is making a lot of news. They give over just about everything. It would probably take me 2 minutes to read all of the data they collect and give away. Also worse for the employees, Zoom allows your boss to track your attention during calls by alerting if you click away from Zoom for more than 30 seconds. So all of a sudden on a call, you'll hear, hey, Tom, click back to the webinar, you know? That's a different world than we're used to as well. So is there a silver lining? Some say yes, and I'll read one sentence from an article that we reference. One potential method of avoiding some of these security issues and limiting the risk is to adopt a zero trust model or zero trust security model where access to business applications, including legacy, is done through a secure web-based gateway following least privilege principles with support for multi-factor authentication and device security checks. And if any one of you yelled out bingo, I agree. So working from home, we have to look at corporate hygiene and efficiency. What can organizations do to help with this? If you find yourself between patch cycles, maybe revisit your access rights policies. See if you can further lock down access by either user or resource. And for each account role, think, what could a bad actor do with this access? It's a great time for user education and awareness around common attacks such as phishing. We want to make sure that contact lists and user directories are updated and accurate. The security person that may have walked across the hall to talk to a developer may not be able to do that right now. So you need to bridge any gaps in communication that may exist while a good part of your workforce may be working from home. Ensuring the good communication channels exist is going to be key. Along with that, users who enjoyed water cooler culture and avoided Slack or virtual collaboration tools, now's the time to get them involved. If you have two-factor authentication set up but not deployed, this is a good time to do it probably. You may want to consider adding it in as many places as possible, and maybe use this time to justify more strict security if executives have pushed back before now. Maybe now's the time that your argument will finally win them over. And finally, perhaps the most complicated in some ways, if your organization uses an asset inventory approach, look for new assets popping up on your virtual network as employees use personal devices to access company resources. Hopefully you have tools that will detect that. If you're using network vulnerability scanning, you're going to be hard-pressed to keep up with new devices. And you also won't have a good historical baseline for comparison. So just having a solid inventory of all your assets lets you triage vulnerable devices as they come on the network faster. You only need to know the software present to compare against a thorough list of vulnerabilities, not wait for a vulnerability scan, which can take, hours, days, or even weeks, depending on the size of your organization. And even then, those vulnerability scanners are only looking for a fraction of the disclosed vulnerabilities. So if that's not enough, vulnerability scanning won't find anything on those personal laptops that are shut off at night either. So the vulnerability scanning side of this, if that's what your shop is doing, you're going to have kind of some growing pains here in several different areas. In addition to worrying about the personal laptop that connects to the corporate network, now you also have to consider all the other devices on those home networks that might be an avenue into the home laptop, which in turn is the avenue into your organization. So BYOD has become LYOD, or leave your own device, and suddenly that's a threat too. E-commerce, trials and tribulations. If we have anyone on the presentation that works in the e-commerce world, I feel bad for you. I hope you get through this. This pandemic has led us to appreciate and curse e-commerce and the ability to shop for everything on demand. Obviously, the brick and mortar shops are going to feel the pain of this. Also brings more challenges for the e-commerce companies, as well as the customers, really. The increased traffic and demand is testing the bandwidth, the server farms, and the general resilience of the company, not to mention the warehouse staffing and the delivery crews. There's a lot of people making that happen, and there's a lot of moving parts. And while a good amount of that is kinetic, it's of course backed up and managed a lot by the digital processes. So your e-commerce applications, your database, all of that's going to be under heavy scrutiny by you and the bad actors probably. We've already seen bad actors using the pandemic for basic fraud, including price gouging, but we're also seeing serious issues in supply chains. While panic buying has shown America what truly empty shelves look like, most people are focused on the lack of toilet paper and rice, but we need to consider the security side of this. With the upheaval in work routines, along with the hiring freezes and layoffs, software updates are being put on hold. Sure, we miss the new features, we miss the shiny things, but that means that the security patches may not be delivered either. Or if so, they could be delayed, meaning a vulnerability disclosed today that might normally be patched in an average of, say, 10 days, now we might be looking at an average of 30 days or 60 days. We've seen Google announce a freeze on Chrome, as well as Chromium, which is used in Microsoft Edge, Opera, and Amazon Silk. This may also impact open source projects, including third-party libraries, as volunteers spend more time focused on family and safety rather than the projects. The FBI has issued an advisory about state-sponsored actors using the Quampire's malware to attack supply chains, including the healthcare industry. And this is a prime time for a different type of bad actor to target e-commerce outlets with potentially reduced security staff, as well as regular organizations with reduced physical security staff. Some of us were around for this fun slogan from DEF CON 6. So in addition to everything that e-commerce outlets looking at right now with the supply chain and attacks on their applications, we have to wonder if this is a prime time for fiscal crime. Consider that in New York, even a week ago, I had written down 442 uniformed officers had tested positive. Yesterday, I looked at the number and it was 730. Over 5,000 police department employees are out sick in New York, and that's 9% of their entire workforce. In New Jersey, over 700 officers from all 21 counties have tested positive. Of course, many other cities are experiencing the same problem. So with that reduction in police force, along with shelter-in-place orders, there's less people or less good citizens on the street to report crime. So it seems like now might be a good time to be a burglar. And while many of us are out of the offices and the businesses are closed, physical security must remain a consideration during the pandemic. This might be a time where temporarily increasing the physical security is a good plan. And the day before this webinar, a news article landed illustrating the point that a Van Gogh painting was stolen from the Singer-Laren Museum outside of Amsterdam that was currently closed to the pandemic. The museum director, Delorme, said during a press conference, quote, "I am shocked and unbelievably pissed off." I bet. During the 2009 economic downturn, there was a 44% rise in some types of crime. Of the 100 agencies who link crime, or who did the research, they link crime directly to the economic woes. 32% reported an uptick in burglaries and 40% increase in thefts from vehicles. So now is not the time to leave any of that sensitive paperwork or a laptop in your car. Awareness is more important now than ever. Our personal lives and our work lives have largely been changed because of the pandemic. Our attention is already kind of spread thin as we're worrying about so many different aspects of this. There are familiar security policies which may no longer apply in our day jobs as we shift from working from home. But on the other hand, strict security policies may mean difficulty for some positions to perform their duties. Where it was easy to do it in the office, now there may be access rules that made it difficult for you when you work from home. And so you have to ask yourself, what if that critical server can't be accessed by a working from home employee tasked with installing a patch or looking at the logs or responding to some incident? We know that opportunistic attackers are increasing, so maintaining and utilizing your various threat intelligence feeds is more important than ever. Keeping up with malware, IP addresses, data breaches, threat actors, vulnerabilities, that's already daunting. It's a real pain in the ass to do that on a good day, we know. There's just so much data and we're drinking from the fire hose. So even though we had those better circumstances, we have to consider now, well, we have that same fire hose, but now we're on limited staff, we're spread thin. How do we respond to that? And so we have to talk about prioritizing risk. In a world that's already challenged, where patching all vulnerabilities is difficult or impossible, what do you do now? What's the new game plan? And since this is uncharted territory, there's no playbook for us to even go on. We all have to kind of adapt and overcome, as they say. One idea that's of interest is categorizing your network like infrastructure. Same with the working from home mandate. Many organizations are experiencing a huge growth in the attack surface. So determine which servers or applications might be temporarily disabled or restricted even further. For vulnerabilities, maybe you have to change your triage criteria where in better times you handled all medium severity or higher, and that was the norm. And then as time permitted, you moved to the low. So in the middle of a pandemic, if things are worse, now you have to worry about high and critical, and then as time permits, move to medium. Well, that's not very granular. So now is a good time to enhance your triage process and base it on more robust intelligence. CVSS, it's kind of an industry standards, but it has its limits. Enough limits for us to fill an 8-part blog series in the past. And that was just talking about version 3 of it. So augmenting your CVSS score by adding the temporal score is good or some equivalent. And there are other companies that even either have their own scores or have proposed them. Whatever system you use, it needs to be based on that increased data. One example is tracking exploit availability. So if an exploit's available, you want to triage that faster. If there's no exploit and it's not remote, well, now you can kind of drop the priority on it. And unfortunately for most organizations, CVE and the National Vulnerability Database, they don't track that exploit availability component. For organizations with a mature incident response team, maybe consider even using a more granular approach based on your own risk scores. Whether it is using a base CDSS or whatever, maybe now is not the time to use the old stoplight system of low, medium, high, and throwing in critical. Maybe now you want to have more of a 10-step, and you want to step down the chain, patching in that order. But again, throw in that exploit availability, throw in the remediation availability, figure out which one of those are the quick wins and which ones are going to be a pain in the ass to fully remediate. So in short, you need to take a risk-based approach to securing all of your assets. Consider the risk, consider what it's going to take to patch, and then figure out the plan to do it. And I know it's easier said than done. I can't imagine what many of you go through in your organizations to make that happen. And in the security world, we know you're heroes, and we know that your praise is often not given, so I'm doing that here. Watch out for bad intelligence, because on the flip side of having that really good threat intelligence is a feed that's not really up to par. Because you have a threat intelligence feed integrated or you've used it for 5 or 10 years, it doesn't mean it's the best. In better times, weaknesses in the threat intel feed might have been made up with more diligence, monitoring network activity, monitoring host processes, monitoring user behavior, just increased everything. But with teams scaled back a little bit, that extra diligence isn't likely to happen. So risk decisions must be made higher up the chain. That has to start with better intelligence. Consider that last year, CVE and the National Vulnerability Database, they didn't aggregate 7,900 publicly disclosed vulnerabilities. And that's 1 year alone. Newer offerings like SNCC or Skybox, one of them offers some library intelligence, but not a lot. The other is basically a mirror of CVE. So there's a lot of shiny lights being put on essentially the same data. Make sure that when you're examining them, it's not just looking at, oh, that portal is slick. Make sure you're looking at the actual data itself. Does this data meet our demands? Is it robust? Is it timely? If your organization responds very well to a limited data set, it looks great on paper because you're handling all the vulns that you know about, but in reality, that means your organization isn't responding to a lot of the additional threats and risk. So remember that bad intelligence leads to spending IT's time and money on fixing the wrong things or fixing them in the wrong order. And right now, you just simply can't afford to do that. So as discussed, bad actors aren't slowing down. They're going strong. We know that they are active enough that they are leaving enough evidence. There's a crowdsourced threat actor campaigns during coronavirus threat on Reddit, for example. This is the one time you can't hit pause. If you do, you're going to put yourself at increased risk, which also may mean increased liability. You also run a different kind of risk when falling behind on patching. If your organization is compromised during this time and you're spread thin, attackers might be able to gain a better foothold, compromise more servers, and basically dig in deep. And so as you get back to normal, it's going to be that much harder to detect them or get them out of your network. Or once you get in, once they get in, there may be multiple groups that have claimed parts of your network. And then it gets really bad fast. And I know that sounds kind of dark and no, that's not likely, but think back to Sony in 2014. That's exactly what happened to them. So a few thoughts on how we see things playing out, kind of a high level. We think that companies that have dropped their staff and opt to hire them back in a few months, they're likely going to have a pick of the litter with so many currently unemployed. And that's probably going to be good for them. They're going to get the best talent for the best price. But the ramp up time to bring them on board while everyone is just getting back to their normal routines and settling in might be kind of chaotic. And that may not be so good for your organization. Plan for that ahead of time. We've seen several articles about security folks coming together to fight coronavirus-related hacking and malware. but I kind of have to ask, will it matter? The articles make it sound like they're especially pissed off that these groups are hacking hospitals during the time of a pandemic. But that also implies that they didn't care before the pandemic. And I have to wonder, weren't we supposed to be fighting all of this before? So I'm happy to see these efforts, and I want to see more of them, but I don't think that the pandemic should be the impetus for us to do so. That should be our daily mode of operation. Back in 2006, Jake had to remind me of this. Insurance companies offered outbreak insurance, and almost no one bought it. That part of the insurance industry basically belly flopped, and it went away. But I have a feeling that after this, we're going to see the return of outbreak insurance, possibly rebranded to pandemic insurance. Ultimately, I don't think any of us can see a clear path ahead of us. Not that clear, because we largely didn't see the path we're on right now until it was too late. So with that, thank you so much again for listening today. Real quick, before we do the Q&A, I'd like to quickly thank, obviously, everyone that joined to listen. Thank my marketing department, which is Brendan and Curtis. They had to put up with me and my irrational request. Me putting the meerkat on the slide as a kind of final ha-ha to them. I'd like to begrudgingly thank our CEO, Jake Coons. He had a lot of ideas for this. And then he said, okay, Brian, you go do it. And so he threw me under the bus to do most of the work. And a big thanks to everyone who's staying isolated and staying safe. So with that, we'll go to Q&A. And there is none. Absolutely no questions asked. Hopefully that means that you're overwhelmed by the presentation. You have a lot to think about. Like I said at the beginning, if you do have questions or you want to discuss any of these points further, and especially if you want to talk about vulnerabilities and nerd out on that, my email address is brian@riskbasedsecurity.com. It's in the document that you can download there. And we'll leave it at that. So thank you again.